Welcome to Tea, Tales, and Talks, where we talk about spooky things, drink some tea, and try not to get too scared. I'm Sarah, I'll be your host.
And I'm Mackenzie, I'll be your co-host.
For these strange and occasionally unsettling tales.
If you like spooky stuff, history, ghosts, ghouls, witches, and mysteries of this world and others, then Tea, Tales, and Talks might be the podcast for you. Join us for all the paranormal tea, haunted tales, and spooky talks. New episodes drop every Monday wherever you get your podcasts.
Until we meet again, our twitchy witchy friends, stay spooky and
don't let your tea get cold.
Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that Down the Crooked Path is researched and recorded in Niagara Falls, Ontario, on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Attawandaron, and the Mississauga of Credit First. This land has been home to Indigenous peoples for thousands of years, and we recognize their enduring connection. We are grateful to share these stories on their lands that carry their histories, and we encourage our listeners to reflect on the past, present, and future of the land they call home. Welcome, wanderers, to Journey Down the Crooked Path, a place where the stories are stranger, the shadows stretch longer, and the things that go bump in the night might just be listening. I'm Amanda Joy, your guide into the eerie, the forgotten, and the downright bizarre. Here, we step off the well-lit roads of Canadian creepies and venture into the murky corners of history, folklore, and the unexplained, where the whispers grow louder and the truth is never quite what it seems. So let's take a deep breath, watch your step, and whatever you do, don't look back. Once you start down the crooked path, you never know what might follow.
In the late 18th century, Paris faced a problem that couldn't be ignored. Its cemeteries were full and the dead were piling up. By the mid-1700s, the Cemetery of the Innocents had been in use for nearly 6 centuries, and its city had grown up around it. The surrounding neighborhoods were suffocating under the weight of decomposition. Bodies were buried in layers, stacked in communal pits, and then the churn houses overflowed. The ground itself began to give way, and in 1774, a section of the streets collapsed into a mass grave, swallowing buildings and sending a clear message. The city had run out of room. Officials turned to the network of limestone quarries beneath Paris, abandoned and sprawling. Beginning in 1785, they began transferring remains into the tunnel, and over the next 2 years, bones from more than 150 burial grounds were moved underground. Beneath Paris eventually held the remains of over 6 million people, arranged in walls and alcoves that still stand today. There's a park in Kingston, Ontario that carries a similar weight. It looks ordinary, a green space with benches and a playground, but beneath the ground tells a different story. The city doesn't advertise it and most visitors don't ask, but the land has a history, and like Paris, it wasn't always a place for the living. In 19th century, Kingston was a colonial hub with ambition. The town sat at the mouth of the Cataraqui River, where Lake Ontario narrowed into the St. Lawrence, and its location made it a strategic prize. British military officers, merchants, and tradesmen filled its streets. Stone buildings rose among the waterfront. Ships docked daily carrying goods and soldiers, and news from Montreal, Quebec, Toronto, and overseas. The town had banks, schools, churches, and a growing population that spilled into new neighborhoods as the century wore on. It was a place that was built to last. But Kingston was also a city of sickness. Its proximity to water made it a magnet for trade and also for disease. Epidemics swept through regularly: typhus, cholera, smallpox. The hospitals were under-equipped, and the quarantine stations along the shorelines were often overwhelmed. Families buried their dead quickly, sometimes without ceremony. The cemeteries filled faster than the city could manage. In the summer months, the air carried the sour smell of waste and heat. In winter, the cold slowed the spread, but it didn't stop it. Death was a part of the rhythm of life in Kingston, and the town learned to keep moving. Cholera arrived in Kingston with the ships. The disease was waterborne, carried by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, and spread through contaminated drinking water and food. In a town built along the lake where waste disposal was primitive and clean water was never guaranteed, the conditions were ideal for an outbreak. The first major wave hit in 1832, part of a global pandemic that had already swept through Europe and eastern seaboards. Immigrants arriving from Britain brought the infected with them, and Kingston, with its busy port and growing population, was quickly overwhelmed. The disease moved fast. Within hours, victims suffered violent diarrhea, dehydration, and collapse. There was no cure. Doctors tried vinegar, bleeding, and burning tar into the streets to purify the air, but nothing worked. The second outbreak came in 1849, and it was worse. The population had grown, but sanitation hadn't improved, and the city's infrastructure couldn't keep up. Cholera spread through boarding houses, military brackets, and tenement blocks. Families buried their dead in haste, hospitals were overcrowded, and the quarantine stations along the waterfront couldn't contain the flow. Then came 1854, another wave, another summer of fear. By then, Kingston had seen enough to recognize the sign, but the recognition didn't mean prevention. The disease returned and the death toll climbed. Each outbreak left behind more than graves. It left a city shaped by its proximity to water and its vulnerability to what that water carried. Malaria was another constant threat in 19th century Kingston. The disease was carried by mosquitoes, which bred in stagnant waters around the city's marshes, wells, and poorly drained streets. At the time, the connection between mosquitoes and malaria hadn't been proven, and most believed the illness came from bad air rising from the swamps and low-lying areas. The symptoms were brutal: fever, chills, vomiting, and weakness that could last for weeks. Some recovered, others didn't. The disease didn't move in waves like cholera, it lagged. It returned with the warm weather and settled into the population like a seasonal curse. Kingston's location made it especially vulnerable. The city was surrounded by water and its infrastructure couldn't keep pace with its growth. Drainage was inconsistent and standing water collected in barrels, ditches, and cisterns. The military brackets and poorer neighborhoods were hit the hardest. Soldiers stationed at Fort Henry and the surrounding garrisons reported frequent cases, and civilian doctors struggled to treat the symptoms with quinine and rest. Malaria didn't cause mass panic, but it wore the people down. It was a part of life expected and endured, and it remained a fixture in the city's medical records well into the early 20th century. Typhus also spread through Kingston in the 19th century with brutal efficiency. Known as ship's fever, it was carried by lice and thrived in crowded conditions with arriving vessels, military brackets, and tenement houses. Immigrants fleeing famine and soldiers rotating through the garrisons brought it ashore, often without knowing that they were infected. The disease caused high fevers, rashes, and delirium, and once it took hold, it moved quickly through households. There was no reliable treatment. Quarantine stations along the waterfront were overwhelmed, and the hospitals lacked the space and resources to contain the spread. In desperation, families took in the sick, hoping to offer shelter and care. The gesture was common, especially among Kingston's working class, but it came at a cost. Typhus didn't stay contained to the infected. It passed easily on to caretakers, children, and anyone who shared space or clothing. Entire households fell ill. Clergy, nurses, and volunteers died alongside those they were trying to help. Burial records from the worst years show a sharp rise in deaths, many marked only by initials or age. The city struggled to keep up pace with the losses. Typhus didn't arrive with spectacle, but it left exhaustion, grief, and a population thinned by its reach. Death toll from Kingston's 19th century epidemics were staggering. Cholera alone claimed hundreds during each outbreak, with the worst years, 1832, 1849, and 1854, leaving the city scrambling to bury its dead. Typhus brought in waves by immigrant ships and spread through lice-infested clothing and bedding, killed entire families. Malaria, though slower and less dramatic, wore down the population year after year. The city's burial infrastructure couldn't keep pace. The cemeteries quickly filled, and the poorest districts, graves were dug shallow and reused. In some cases, bodies were buried without coffins, wrapped in cloth, and lowered into the earth before the next wave arrived. Emergency burials became common. During peak outbreaks, the dead were collected in carts and moved to designated burial grounds by night. Clergy performed abbreviated rites, or none at all. In the worst weeks, mass graves were dug, long trenches where bodies were placed side by side, covered quickly and marked with temporary wooden crosses. The city's records from these periods are incomplete. Many deaths went undocumented, especially among the poor, the transient, and the recently arrived. The burial sites were chosen for convenience, not permanence. Some were later built over, others were forgotten or erosion or construction exposed the remains. The upper burial ground was established in Kingston in 1819, serving as the city's primary cemetery for nearly half a century. It was divided into 3 sections, each designated for a major denomination: Anglican, Roman Catholic, and Presbyterian. The land was common, shared by the churches, and open to the city's growing population. It became the first resting place for soldiers stationed at Fort Henry, immigrants who arrived sick or destitute, and residents who died from the recurring waves of cholera, typhus, and malaria. The cemetery was heavily used during epidemics, when burials were frequent and records were inconsistent. The graves were dug quickly, often without markers, and the soil was shallow, pressed against the limestone bedrock beneath the city. The burial ground expanded as needed, absorbing the dead from boarding houses, hospitals, and quarantine stations. By the 1860s, more than 10,000 people were estimated to be buried there. At this point, the upper burial ground had reached its limit. The cemetery had been in use for over 40 years, absorbing the dead from every corner of Kingston. The ground was now crowded with graves overlapping. Many of the markers had rotted or been removed, and during heavy rains, the soil shifted and bones would surface. The cemetery sat near the heart of the city, bordering the growing residential streets, and its conditions had become impossible to ignore. Sanitation was a concern. The smell alone was enough to prompt complaints, and families stopped visiting. The clergy stopped officiating, and the city began looking for alternatives. 2 new cemeteries were established to relieve the pressure. The Cataraqui Cemetery opened in 1850, sprawling across the wooded area west of the city. It was designed with space, privacy, and permanence in mind. St. Mary's Cemetery followed, serving the Roman Catholic population with a similar intent. These new burial grounds offered order and distance, which were qualities the upper burial ground no longer had. As burials shifted away, the old cemetery fell into neglect. With its broken fences and grasses that grew too high, farmers let their cattle graze among the headstones. Children would play there, and stones ended up overturned, stolen, or were used for building material. The city had stopped maintaining the grounds, and by the end of the decade, a decision was made. The upper burial ground would be closed.
You. Yeah, you. Still haunting the same old fast fashion? Time to dig up something better with Back from the Dead Goods, a Canadian small business where forgotten threads get a second life and sustainability meets spooky. This isn't just upcycled clothing, it's resurrected fashion with an eerie edge. Handpicked, reworked, and revived, every piece is as unique as a ghost story whispered at midnight. And because you're a part of the Canadian Creepies family, you get an exclusive deal. Use code Canadian Creepies at checkout for 10% off. Find them lurking on Instagram, Etsy, and Poshmark. Links are in the episode description. Give your wardrobe a second chance at life, if you dare. Once upon a time, in the land of everyday moments, there lived a sprinkle of magic called icing sugar photography. From sticky cake smash smiles to wind-swept yes moments, they capture the sugar sweet, the beautifully messy, and everything in between. Whether you're a blushing bride or a blooming family, or just want to freeze time for a second, Icing Sugar Photography is your fairy god lens. Visit icingsugarphotography.com and follow along on Instagram at icingsugarphoto. Let your story sparkle, because life is sweet and memories should be too. Looking for your next obsession? The Creators Collective Podcasts is your gateway to the dark, the chilling, and the downright fascinating. We're a community of independent podcasts with one goal: to share the best in true crime, paranormal tales, folklore, and unexplained mysteries. Whether you crave cold cases that won't stay closed, haunted histories that refuse to be forgotten, or stories that make you sleep with the lights on, there's a show waiting for you in the collective. And when you join us, you're not just listening to one podcast. You're stepping into a world of creators who love this stuff as much as you do. Check out the Creators Collective today. Follow the link in our show notes to discover your next favorite podcast. We'll be waiting for you.
By the end of the decade, the churches who had originally managed the burial grounds were to turn the grounds over to the city, and negotiations followed. For one, the land was to remain consecrated. No commercial development would be permitted. The area must remain open to the public, but used respectfully. And the city was required to ensure the land wouldn't fall into neglect again, promising to maintain the grasses and fences. The city took ownership of the grounds and began planning its conservation. The decision was made to turn the cemetery into a public park. It would be cleaned, leveled, and landscaped. The exhumations began in the late 1880s after the city finalized plans to convert Upper Burial Ground into a public park. The churches had agreed to transfer under strict conditions, and part of that agreement included relocating as many remains as possible to the two new cemeteries. Workers moved through the grounds with shovels and ledgers, opening graves that hadn't been touched in decades. But what they found wasn't consistent. Some of the graves held multiple bodies, stacked without markers or separation. In fact, one grave contained 11 corpses, all buried together with no identification of who they were or when they had died. Families came forward to claim plots, but many couldn't be located. Other graves were empty. The soil had settled, the markers long gone, and there was no trace of any remains. This led to rumors quickly about resurrectionists. The medical school at Queen's University was less than a mile away and needed cadavers for dissections, and legal supply was scarce. The locals whispered that bodies had been stolen and sold to anatomy labs. Grave robbing wasn't uncommon in the 19th century, especially near teaching hospitals, and the conditions of the cemetery would have made it easy. The exhumation at the Upper Burial Ground was halted before the work was complete. While the city originally had planned to relocate as many remains as possible, the process proved to be more difficult than expected. The cost of labor, transportation, and reburial climbed quickly, and the conditions of the graves complicated everything. Many of the bodies hadn't fully decomposed. The soil was shallow, and the limestone bedrock beneath Kingston had preserved parts of the remains. Workers uncovered coffins with intact clothing, hair, and flesh. The discovery slowed progress and raised concerns about sanitation and public reaction. The city made the decision to stop. Only about 1,000 bodies were moved, an estimated 9,000 were left behind. The remaining graves were covered with fill, layers of clean soil, gravel, and sod brought in to level the ground and suppress any further exposure. The headstones, many of them cracked or leaning, were laid flat. Workers pressed them into the earth and buried them beneath the new surface. A few monuments were left standing, but most markers disappeared after the landscaping. The city named it City Park, a rather practical name meant for easy filing and council records. Crews brought in fill by the cartload, layering soil over the burial trenches and cholera pits. Trees were planted where quarantined dead had been lowered. Footpaths were cut into sections that once held rows of unmarked graves. The churches had required that the land remained consecrated, and the city complied. No buildings went up, no vendors were permitted. The space was open, municipal, and quiet. Years later, the name changed. McBurney Park, named for an elderman who pushed for repairs and maintenance. Despite this, the park has had an eerie nickname, Skeleton Park. It's called this by children and their parents, locals, and for good reason. It's called Skeleton Park because the ground didn't hold. The limestone shelf beneath Kingston sat close to the surface, and the burial trenches had never been deep. Over time, frost heaved the soil, rain softened it, and in spring, the corners of old tombstones pushed back through the grass. Some were still legible, others fractured, their inscriptions worn to initials or partial dates. Children still trip over them. Mowers clip them. The city sends in crews to tamp them down sometimes. Bones surface too. A femur after a storm, teeth tangled in tree roots. Once a skull was unearthed during a landscaping project in the 1960s, believed to be that of a child. The workers reburied what they found, as they often do, sometimes with ceremony, sometimes without. The park has no fences. There's no warning signs. Families picnic where typhus dead had been buried in haste. Dogs run over cholera trenches. The nickname didn't come from folklore or legend. It comes from history that literally resurfaces every now and then. In the 1990s, the city began to place markers and small plaques mounted along the park in remembrance of what the park once was. They listed the cemetery's original name and the year the cemetery was established, as well as the estimated number of burials. The full list of names, though, was never recovered. There are far too many gaps in the records, and many of the graves were never formally recorded or marked. Later, a larger interpretive sign was installed near the northern entrance with a map of the original cemetery's layout and a brief history of the epidemics that had filled it. The sign included a note about how the exhumations were extended to only a fraction of the bodies and how the rest remain beneath the earth. The Barclay Monument stands near the northern edge of the park and is one of the few vertical markers left untouched when the cemetery was transformed. It was too large to move and too prominent to bury. The obelisk is carved with the name of Reverend John Barclay, who died in 1826, and it remains visible today, surrounded by grass and footpaths. There are a few smaller markers that have survived as well, though many are partially buried or worn beyond recognition. Some have been repositioned over the years with the park's conservation, placed near trees or along the perimeter where they won't interfere with the public use. And of course, with a history as grisly as Skeleton Park, there are local ghost stories. Locals began reporting strange encounters near the Barclay Monument, a figure seen standing in the fog, unmoving. You can hear footsteps on the gravel path, although no one is behind you, and cold spots that linger near the old Presbyterian section. The site has become a focal point for sightings, especially after rain or frost heaves, when the ground shifts and fragments of the headstones reappear. The Haunted Walk of Kingston also includes Skeleton Park on its route, sharing stories of bones surfacing in tree roots, tombstones pushing up through the grass, and the cannon placed at its entrance as a warning to grave robbers. The cannon there isn't decorative. It was installed to mark the epidemic of body theft and the city's attempt to deter further desecrations. Cities grow over their dead. Cemeteries are absorbed into the grid, their boundaries softened by sidewalks and tree lines, their histories folded into zoning plans and park commissions. The people buried beneath our neighborhoods lived in tenements, boarding houses, poor farms, and quarantine wards. They worked in mills, kitchens, stables, and laundries. Some died in epidemics that swept through cities faster than records could be kept. Others were buried in haste without ceremony, in trenches dug beneath hospitals or along the edges of churchyards. Their names were written in ledgers that no longer exist. Their graves were marked with wood that rotted or stone that was later removed to make way for sidewalks and playgrounds. These people were never famous. They didn't leave estates or monuments. They left behind children, debt. And in the shape of their absence, the city expanded over them. Streets were laid, parks were planted, apartments built up where the burial grounds once stood. The bodies sometimes weren't moved. They were built around. They remain in the soil beneath basements, parking lots, under the quiet corners of public spaces where nothing ever seems to grow quite right. So the next time you walk through a quiet park, ask yourself, what lies beneath?